Hello, we're back and we're going to continue talking about pneumonia, COPD, and other respiratory disorders and how to code them. Okay, pneumonia falls in a code category range of J12 through J18, and these codes cover the specific type of pneumonia, whether it's due to a virus, not elsewhere classified. Just because we know it's a virus doesn't mean that we have a specific code for the virus. It could be pneumonia due to strep, could be pneumonia due to philus influenza, bacterial pneumonia, and many, many others. Keep reading past the main term of pneumonia to get the microorganism that's causing the pneumonia. With viral pneumonia, primarily it affects the trachea and the bronchi, and some of the different microorganisms that affect these areas are listed here. Adenovirus, respiratory syncytial virus, the RSV, parainfluenza, SARS, and pneumonia due to COVID-19, which of course has been in the news a lot. With pneumonia due to COVID-19, and this is one reason we want to use current code books because this was not explicitly the same. Pneumonia due to COVID-19 is J12.18. This includes all the diseases of pneumonia that's due to the coronavirus. J1218 distinguishes this pneumonia that's due to COVID from any other types of viral pneumonia, including SARS-associated pneumonia. And of course, everybody knows about the different manifestations of COVID-19. If you've been paying attention to the news, can cause cough, fever, malaise, fatigue, shortness of breath, all these unpleasant things. And the way you would find it is go in the alphabetic index, main term, pneumonia, and then COVID-19, and it'll direct you to J1282. Pneumonia that's due to strep is a different code category than that. It is J13, and this could be bronchopneumonia and what have you. There is a code first note on J13. Let's have a quick look at that. And here's what I was talking about with these. You can see right here, code first, associated influenza, if applicable, J09.X1, and so on. Code also, meaning to follow the associated abscess. And then another one under J14, code-associated flu, and any abscess as well. We just covered this one, the Haemophilus influenza bacterial infection seen mainly in children and debilitated adults. And again, important thing to keep in mind is keep reading past the main term of pneumonia. What type of pneumonia is it? And we can have bacterial pneumonia. However, the code system, even though we have only over 70,000 codes, not all the different microorganisms can fall into this. This is the difference between not elsewhere classified versus not otherwise specified. Not otherwise specified means they just said it was pneumonia. Not elsewhere classified means they did say what it was, there just isn't a specific code created for it. And here's some examples. We have the Pseudomonas, Streptococcus B, Staphylococcus, and others. And of course, we get into pneumonia that's due to other infectious organisms, the J16. And again, the same kind of code as first code also notes that we saw earlier. Pneumonia and diseases classified elsewhere, J17. Again, this is the type of pneumonia that's a result of another disease. And this code shows in italics, so it's not the first code, or even a single code, right? So you code the underlying infection, the rheumatic fever, the schistomiasis, what have you, and then you code the manifestation of pneumonia with a J17 code. I hope that makes sense. Let's take a look and we'll spell it out here. And again, this is exactly what we're talking about. With J17, we're going to code the underlying disease first. That means the Q fever of A78, the rheumatic fever I00, the B65 through B65, 9, the schistomiasis. These would be classified elsewhere. Note also they have all these different types of pneumonias that are carved out. Excludes one. Excludes one, once again, means it's mutually exclusive. You can't have a pneumonia that's classified somewhere else and then have it be this type of pneumonia. And with J18, this is the general global, not otherwise specified pneumonia. In other words, they just said it was pneumonia. Maybe they weren't able to run a test and figure out what it was, right? So J18, and there's some little divisions we'll see in the fourth character right now. And again, note here, if it has this 4 with the check mark, that means we need a fourth character. This only has 3. So if we just coded J18, it's an invalid code. We also have code first associated influenza and all the excludes notes that we saw earlier in a similar fashion. So note J18-0, bronchopneumonia, unspecified organism, excludes 1, right? So they have the hypostatic bronchopneumonia, lipid pneumonia, right? And excludes 2, right? Notice with this excludes 2, it says bronchiolitis, acute and chronic. So excludes 2, of course, we can have it if the documentation supports both codes. So important things to remember about this code category. This is unspecified, number 1. Number 2, you're going to need 4 characters. So it's got to be one of these. And acute lower respiratory infections are the J20 through J22 code categories. Bronchitis is an example of this. Bronchitis can either be acute or chronic. Chronic usually is resulting from some sort of exposure, cigarettes, industrial chemicals, what have you. And can also be caused by other microorganisms, as you can see here. With acute bronchitis, we can have it due to mycoplasma, strep, coccidiovirus, parainfluenza, RSV, and others. And again, the key here is to read past pneumonia and pick up the specific bronchitis. What I mean by that, in the same way that we don't stop reading just when we see bronchitis or pneumonia, we keep reading after the terms acute bronchitis, and that'll lead us to the correct code. Acute bronchiolitis sounds kind of similar. It is in some ways similar. It's an inflammatory disease of the bronchioles caused by a viral infection, right? And again, in the same way that we can have bronchitis, pneumonia, all these different things that cause these bronchioles to become inflamed, this is what we can have here as well. And other diseases coded to the upper respiratory tract. These are some of the ones that we're familiar with. And these include such things as allergic rhinitis, chronic sinusitis, nasal polyps, and others. So again, main terms, usually if you can, it's not whether it's chronic, it's usually what it is. Abscess, laryngitis, disease, and so on. And that's all I have for you. We'll continue on with more coding of diseases of the respiratory system shortly. Bye now.